Hello, this video is designed to discuss proposals for school reform. And in short, school reform, or reform in general, is change. So we're looking at proposals for school change or possible school change. So, the first thing that you want to look at is the impact that the changes in education make on society, which is a theme that we've already started discussing how society affects education and how education affects society. So, by changing education and making it more powerful and more applicable to real world, we're actually bettering society. However, if we don't reform education and let it become stagnant and not change with society or change with what is needed in society, then we actually harm society. Now, that's easier said than done because very common people talk about change, act like they want change, but when it comes down to changing, nobody really wants to change. So, and that is painful. You'll see in public ed, changes happen quickly, and sometimes changes happen before the explanation for the change has actually occurred. And then some changes happen slowly. So, small changes happen quickly, but big mindset changes happen slowly because, again, mindsets just in general do not change at the drop of a dime. What's important, though, to remember is that change is not about just being creative or thinking of creative ideas. They have to be strategic. You have to be strategically creative. You have to have a plan and a reason for it. You can't just go making changes in education and not look at how that's going to affect society in the next 10 or 15 years, because the changes we make to these kindergartners, by the time they graduate from school 13, 14 years ago, or 13, 14 years from now, they're going to change the world at that point. So you have to be very careful and really account for the changes you're making to the students in education now are going to affect society. So you need to be strategic about it. Okay, so the first thing is world change, again, affects educational change. So, how has the world changed? And this is something that we kind of have to debate every couple of decades, and every couple of years. How has the world changed from the population 10 years ago, 20 years ago? We have more of a diverse population than ever before, especially in America. We have different people who speak different languages. We have a huge influx of ESOL or English as a second language group of learners. We have more technology than we've ever had before. Because of that technology, we can actually change our processes and procedures. We can simplify them, we can streamline them, we can change them. So technology affects those processes and procedures that we've used in the past. How has the job market changed? Again, based upon technology, based upon processes and procedures. Do we have a different job market than we have had in the past? Case in point, factory workers. We don't have nearly as many factory workers or textile mills as we have in the past because technology has taken over that job or it has been moved and outsourced. So the job market does change, and we have to make sure that we're preparing people for that job market. What about values, which we've discussed before? How have the society's values changed over the decades? Also, how has the pace of life changed? And again, pace of life affects education because what students do outside of school and their pace of life outside of school affect their inside of school attention spans, as well as what they're able to do in terms of homework and parental involvement. So, keeping in mind that the world's changed, we have to make sure that we change education to reflect that. So, how do we accommodate different populations? How do we accommodate, if we have an influx of diverse students, how do we accommodate those students? Or are we accommodating those students? Or are we teaching the same old way to the same old American population? How do we accommodate the ESOL or the English as a second language learner students? Are we accommodating them appropriately? How do we integrate technology? Are we doing that well? Are we doing it enough to prepare students for the future? Or do we use those same old processes? Are we teaching in the same way we taught 25 years ago, even though we know that that's not the way students are going to use it in the future? And most importantly, are we educating students for jobs of tomorrow, or are we educating them for jobs of today? It's very difficult to educate people for jobs of tomorrow when we don't know what those jobs are. But again, going back to creative and strategically planning. A book, if you're interested in change and how the world has changed over the recent decades, especially based upon technology, is The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. And his whole theory within this book is that the world is flat in that there's globalization and competition in the world. Because in the past, and this is all based upon technology. In the past, we were somewhat isolated based upon our countries because we couldn't really connect via technology the way that we can now. And so now that you can telecommute, now that we have access via Skype or web conferencing or whatnot, we can contact anybody in the world at any time. We're no longer tied to a location. So technology allows you to work, play, and exist really everywhere, which means you're no longer competing with other Americans for jobs. You're competing with the entire world. And so your a location is not an issue anymore for getting a job. It's the person who gets the job is the person who has the best education, the best skills, and the know how to get the job done. It doesn't matter where your degree per se come from. It doesn't matter per se where you live or what your native language is. If you can do the job and you can do it well and you're creative and you can critically think, you're going to get the job. So that should be a wake up call to Americans to say, you know, you can't be mediocre at any point. You have to compete with China and India and all of these different countries that have more people and who within debate are more educated and have different values related to education. So, an interesting book to read if you're interested in that kind of thing. So, looking at the change of educational change, who has the advantage in schools? Out of all this diverse population we have, who is the most likely to succeed? And in most cases, it's going to be the person with the most resources because education, unfortunately, is not equal. Now, we can teach them all the same. We can give them all the same nutritional values at lunch. We can give them all the same homework. We can do all of that. But outside of school, there are differences. Students have different technology access. Some have computers at home, some have 3 iPads, some have nothing. They have different literature access. Some students grow up with plenty of books in their home and magazines and newspapers. Some grow up with none. Communication access. Some come from well versed parents who speak well, write well. Some come from parents who don't really communicate with them or are always working and they're busy, so they don't necessarily communicate as much. And then, of course, funding, which is really kind of what it boils down to. Some parents and schools have, or some parents and families have money, and some do not. And based upon that, those that have more technology background, communication, and funding are usually those that are more successful, unfortunately. So, those that are poor, those that speak another language, that don't have an adequate education, that don't come from enriched backgrounds, are probably going to have a tougher time. Which goes back to our point of, those who kind of have an enriched background are the ones that are probably going to get those jobs because just the nature of what they've been afforded. So, having said all of that, a point to be made is that that doesn't mean that our schools are bad. A couple of years ago in 1983, a article was published called A Nation at Risk, and it really put people up in arms because it pointed out flaws in Americans' educational system, and it compared America to other countries. And it basically said the conclusion that they drew was that the American schools were failing because they were not as advanced as the other countries based upon test scores. And so, through that conclusion, America is failing our children. But having said all that, there was no real hard evidence or suggestions made. So, again, it was somewhat of a media outcry that really did not have any substance when it really got boiled down to. But again, it's something that we've continuously held on to for quite a few years. So the question is it even fair to compare educational systems from other countries? Is it fair to compare us to Holland or us to Finland or us to China or us to India? Is that even fair to compare the educational system itself without comparing the society and the values of education as well? Because we've already established that the society and values of education line right up with educational value and educational prosperity. So, if we look at countries that are better, that have better educational systems, that have higher test scores, we see a couple of threads. We see that teachers are paid more. We see that there's less diversity among students. So in certain countries, they're more homogeneous. You don't have a bunch of different people from different backgrounds. So in terms of ethnicity, in terms of social economics, in terms of language, they all speak the same language. They're all middle class. They're all whatever they are. There's usually more parental involvement. They have stricter classroom management or punishments. They're allowed to have stricter classroom management. They also have more recess or break time for their students. There's less standardized tests, and they actually focus more on authentic, creative learning to prepare them for the future. And there's a big value on education. In one video in particular that I've watched about Chinese students is that they attend school on Saturday, and some students attend regular public school during the day, and then they attend night school to help them get ahead within the school system. So they constantly attend school. So from all this, you see it's not an educational issue. It's a lot of it is society and value of education issue. Because in short, these other countries have invested more in education. So no wonder they have better test scores and no wonder they're having higher prosperity. So outside of education, we commonly point the picture that the public schools are failing. So you see a lot in the media that almost everything you see in the media related to public schools are that they're not doing well, they're failing, when that's actually not the case. But that doesn't mean that we can't improve because there's always room for change and reform. So, one issue with that is, though, that no one can agree on what needs to be changed and how to change it. So we all agree change is needed, but exactly how to go about doing it, we don't agree. These are both kind of two sides to what some people think. Some people think schools should be competitive and that students should be competing, kind of like our the world is flat issue. Some focus more on collaboration or working together. Some believe that school is about meeting certain goals and objectives, kind of like our standards that in our standards and our tests that measure goals and objectives. And some believe more about authentic and individual learning and assessments for the individual. Some believe that we should be teaching a core set of knowledge and kind of like our common core standards. And some believe that it should be diverse based upon the different students. Some believe that we should have a stable system, which is just based upon it's set in stone and we don't ever change it. And then some believe that we should constantly adjust that system to maximize the potential of of the students that we have. So what it boils down to is, do we teach the way we always have because we know it works, or do we teach for the future because that's what we're preparing the students for? Now, if you kind of leaned on the future and authentic assessment and individual assessment, if you want to do that, how are we doing that with standardized tests? How are we doing authentic assessments? How are we doing reaching the full potential of each student based upon their different diversity and individualization if we're just giving everybody a standardized test? So, again, sometimes there's disconnects of what we want to do and our goal and what we actually fulfill and how we measure it. So, there is a means to the madness. Why do we test? All standardized testing is not wrong. It's designed to allow for one person to judge the ability of a specific measure or objective. So the way it works is I would define a measure. So I want everyone to know their multiplication facts. I make a test to measure it. So I make a test to measure everybody how people know their multiplication facts and how many they know. And then I look at those scores and based upon student A knows 10% of them, student B knows 20%, that kind of thing. And I can compare students based upon those test scores. So that makes this pretty straightforward, pretty easy. But there are quite a few problems because it's not as crystal clear. Number one, not all students have the same standards, and that's kind of changing based upon Common Core, which is more of a national curriculum. But up until that point, different states had different standards. So how could you compare Florida to Georgia when they didn't even teach the same thing? The next is that not all teachers teach the same way, and that, despite how standardized we make public education, will never be able to be completely standardized. You can't turn each teacher into a robot and have them teach a certain way. So they're going to have different experiences. Not all learners learn in the same way. So that kind of is different among each student. Not all students are good test takers, which, will account for the standardized test, and not all students care about those scores on the test. So if you have a student who just comes in there and takes the test and does whatever and doesn't really even read the questions, now your data is invalid. And then not all students have the same resources, which we talked about before, to prepare. So based upon that, there are just too many variables to draw a conclusion about a student's education or, furthermore, a teacher's ability to teach based upon one test score. So, the majority of schools that have been labeled as problems that have per se low test scores actually have the following characteristics. They serve severe poverty level students. The parents of those students have very little education. There's little parental involvement, and it's not because the parents don't want to be involved, but sometimes it's because those parents are working 3 or 4 jobs because they don't have a high paying job because they don't have an education. There's lack of resources at home in terms of technology, in terms of communication because the parents aren't home, in terms of um, literature and things like that. So there's a lack of resources at home that we talked about before. Those schools also serve diverse populations, so a lot of different minorities who are not used to the culture of America, as well as a lot of non English speaking students. So, how are we going to compare those test scores based upon this population to test scores of students who do have those resources, who do speak English, who do have the funding, and who do have parents with good educations and are involved? How are we going to compare those two and actually make good judgments based upon that, knowing the differences between the groups? Also, if a teacher is really worth her salt, she would be one who teaches based upon the student's interest, based upon the diversity within the school, based upon the society problems. They would know what's going on in society and they would be questioning and trying to educate the students on how to fix it when they become adults. They'll be teaching based upon new ideas, authentic solutions. They will be teaching for the future. However, none of that can be tested on a standardized test. So, if you know as a teacher that your students are going to take a standardized test and they're going to place judgments on you based upon how well that student did on that test, how is that going to influence how you are going to teach? Are you going to teach the way we just listed here on the left, or are you going to teach based upon that standardized test? Next, your text will define systemic reform or systematic reform, and that is based upon administrative structure, instructional materials that are used to teach, the support provided for students and families, the teacher freedom and expertise that are used to allow teachers to make decisions on how to teach based upon those instructional materials, as well as the classroom environment as a whole. Now, you'll see most schools have a problem with at least one of these categories, if not more than one. As a school and as schools in general, we have a tendency to focus on the input. So, what we as teachers or as a school system can give. So, we look at let's get new tech. We have issues, fine, let's get new textbooks. We have issues, great, let's put new requirements on for teachers. We have issues, fine, we'll get a new curriculum. We have issues, fine, we'll get new instructional strategies. It's all about what we can do. But this is where we're getting it wrong because we should be focused on the output, not the input. So we should be focused on what the students themselves can do. What are the goals for the students? What are the expectations for them? Are we correctly measuring those goals? What's the plan for those who don't succeed? Because you're going to have some that don't succeed. What are we going to do with those students? Are we authentically assessing them to make sure we know what each individual student can directly or indirectly do? And then what are some ways we can gain that student and parent feedback? So it's more about what the students can do. It's not about what we can do. It's about what the students can do because they're the product we're pushing out. Now, this is very similar to classroom instruction. The input mentality is, as a teacher, I am the provider of the knowledge. Those who believe that very much have a lecture based class. They do a lot of talking, the students do a lot of sitting and listening, which means the students are passive. There's little evidence that the students have learned. They give maybe 2 or 3 tests. That's all you get, knowing what the students can or cannot do. And it's little deeper thought is asked of the students. There's no discussions, there's no debates, there's none of that. It's more of about me as a teacher. Now, on the other end of that is the output mentality of how are you as a student interpreting and applying this information. So it's not really about the sage on the stage. It's not really about the teacher. It's about the students. You make them active via discussions, via collaboration, via group work, via debates, via internships, via working out in the community, via asking higher order thinking questions that cause them to think and apply. And based upon all that, you get clear evidence of what a student can and cannot do and exactly what they're good at and what they're not good at, which is information the student needs to succeed. And the teachers give them just enough to make them think. They don't teach them everything. They don't water it down for them. They give them just enough because, again, teaching's not just about the content, it's about teaching people to think. So, let's look at the battle of the assessments so that you understand the difference. So, you have a high stakes test, and that's typically a standardized test. They call it high stakes because, again, there are high stakes if you don't pass. In the past, standardized tests meant, if you did not pass a certain portion of a certain standardized test, you may not get advanced to the next level. You may have to go into the remediation program. So, it's very high stakes. Now, with those type of standardized tests, they're easy to measure, right? Because again, we've discussed you chug the data. They're easy to compare. You made a 90, I made a 100. Easy, compare them. They're very generalized, however. The majority of them are multiple choice, true, false, very general. Everybody gets the same thing. They are heavily tied to accountability for the teacher. So the teacher has to, if the students do not perform at a certain level, it's tied to the teacher's ability to teach. But what do they really tell you other than that you made this grade and that's less than the rest of the class? What does that really say? What do I do with you now? What does that mean? Does that mean you don't really know the content? I've only measured you one time in this one way. So, different than that is authentic assessment, which you've heard I've mentioned several times, and that's you've heard it called different things, project based, and it's more based. It's not really a test. It's other ways that you can show what you know. Now, those are harder to measure because they have a tendency to be somewhat subjective. It's more writing, it's more projects. It's not just a fill in the blank test. I can't just chug the data. They're harder to compare because every student turns in something very different. So it's hard to say, well, this is better than this one. They're not, they're just different. It's very individualized. So every student is turning in something in their own right, which is good in the aspect of what have you learned, but it's bad in terms of measuring and comparing. It makes the students accountable. They're not just taking a test, they're actually having to put in effort and higher order thinking. And what does it tell you about what a student knows? Well, you can see if you write a reflection essay, if you build a project, the teacher can tell much more about what the student knows than from just a test. So, again, authentic assessments, which are projects, portfolios, essays, reflections, internships, experiences, yes, they are more subjective to grade, but they do ask students to use higher order thinking, compare the knowledge of what they already have to what they already or what they gain to what they know, and they typically ask you to apply that information to real world situations, and it also validates that you know how to apply it. So, based upon all of that, can a test really do that? Now, moving on a little bit, we're going to look at schools and zoning. So, traditionally in the past, it was the school that you attended was based upon the zoning. And so, someone in the school or someone, superintendent or board of education, or someone would lay out which schools are in each zone, and you went to the school that was closest to your house. Now, that's assuming there was more than one school in your district. A lot of people from smaller counties only have one school, so you obviously went to that one school. But for the most part, you're transported by bus to the closest school based upon your home, which has kind of been. And that was an easy transportation. You had short rides because you were going to the school closest to your house. One question is, did you get a homogeneous population? So, were you getting, if we all live in a good neighborhood and the houses in that neighborhood are expensive, did that make the population a little bit, kind of the same, or were the students coming from the same? If you were lived in a school that had a lot of, government housing, did that mean that a lot of the students were coming from the same backgrounds, the same situation? So did you kind of have a lack of diversity from that? Also, is there overcrowding in some areas? If there's more houses in one zone, then that meant that school was going to get more children than the other one. So did it cause an increase in different populations based upon the different zones? Does it make them incomparable? So again, if you have one school that has high dollar houses and you have one school that doesn't, based upon the neighborhoods that they serve, are you really able to compare those test scores? Because yes, they're within the same district, but look how different they are based upon their population. And then the target question, which leads to our next conversation, is what about what the parents want? So what do the parents want? What if the school that is in your zone, you don't, as a parent, particularly like it, and you want them to go to a zone, or you want them to go to a school that's not out of your zone, that's across town? How does that work? So that brings in school choice. And the bottom line of school choice is that parents get to pick what school their students attend. Now, this is more of a conversation. It's not that readily popular, especially in Georgia. Pretty much you still go to the school that you're zoned in. But there are some, again, reforms that we're talking about, future change, to where school choice is a possibility. Now, why is school choice a good idea? Well, the proponents for it are saying that it allows for incentives for schools to perform based upon that competition. Because if the parents can choose which school their children go to, they're probably going to pick the ones that have the higher test scores or that are, having high performing. So that's the one they're going to pick. So schools are going to compete against each other to do that. Students are not stuck attending a school just because of their location. So, again, if there is a really nice school across town, just because you can't get to, and just because it's not in your zone, doesn't mean you can't go to it. This would allow students to be matched based upon their needs. So maybe there's a school across town that works really well with LD students, learning disabled students. You would be able to go to that school versus not because of your location. Also, students can attend schools based upon the shared values of their families. So, the teaching styles that they use, the social economics, the religious preference, all of those type things you can actually pick. It's not just about your location. School choice can has a tendency to make schools homogeneous, so there isn't any diversity. You kind of have people of like minds tend to go to the same school and stick together. So, one question to ask is, do we need diversity in schools? Do you need, as a student, to be around lots of different peoples with lots of different beliefs, with different SES, with different language barriers, with different backgrounds? Do you need that to prepare you for your future and the real world? Also, transportation is a huge issue because if you live in one location and your parents choose to send you to a school across town, whose responsibility is it to get you there? Do we redefine bus routes? Did the bus routes go based upon the students? I mean, because you could be in for a very long drive and the bus driver could be going all types of everywhere. It could be a maze. Or is it the parents' responsibility? If you're choosing for your child to go to a school outside of your zone, you have to transport them. Now, if that's the case, then school choice really isn't fair because it doesn't account for the parents who work full time or who have limited transportation. If you work full time and have to be at work by a certain time, you can't take your kid across town to go to school. And if transportation is not provided, then you really don't have a school choice. You have to go to the one that's the closest to your children have to go to the one that's closest to you. Also, it fosters unfair competition, which goes back to the comparing of test scores. Because again, if they are homogeneous, and if you do end up having one school based upon those who can transport and can go, and then everybody else goes to the school closest to them, and you're comparing those test scores, then it really is unfair. And also, some research, as your textbook relates, parents aren't actually picking based upon the academic rigor. They're not picking based upon the test scores. They're actually picking based upon the prestige, the location, the political, religious, or philosophical alignment. They're picking the school that their friends are going to. They're picking the school that's the most talked about among their group of their subgroup within society. It's not really about the academics at that point. So the next question is, if school choice is a possibility, how is it handled? How procedure wise do parents go about picking the school? And the first thing is vouchers. And basically that means that parents are giving a voucher which holds tax money. which is in the form of a voucher, and they give that voucher and the money, the tax money associated with it, to the school that they choose. Now, issues with that are, what if you choose a school? What if you choose for your child to go to a school outside of your district? That means that tax money is going outside of the district. So it's causing competitions among districts. And then again, you get unproportional. More people are going to the schools in this district, so they have more money to spend on schools. And the ones that nobody's going to don't have money because nobody's going to them. So how are they going to improve without funding? Also, what about private schools? Because there is an issue of vouchers being used for private schools, so tax money for private schools. Also, what about diversity and special needs? So, if you have all the parents who are able to pick a school and transport their students to or their children to that school, then again you start getting less diversity among the schools. And also, how does that affect special needs students? You don't want all the special needs students in one school, because then how are they going to be able and prepared for their future to be around non-disabled students? And is this almost a way of us segregating ourselves again? I mean, how are we, if we are all picking our own school and we're picking based upon what we're most comfortable with, then aren't we segregating ourselves among, say, social economics, ethnicity, religious beliefs? I mean, obviously, people are going to pick based upon how they believe, so you're going to end up with schools that have all the same beliefs, but then again, we're not diverse. We've kind of segregated ourselves. Next, though, other than vouchers, another way school choice can be handled are charter schools. And so, charter schools are public schools. So now they're not private schools, they're public schools. But they are created, when they're created, which is based upon a request from the district, they don't have to follow all of the state and federal regulations that a regular school would have to follow. So they're kind of relieved of those because they're a charter school. Which sometimes, though, however, means that they don't get all of the funding, because we talked about before, sometimes the federal government will give money and say, we'll give you this money if you do this. Well, if you don't do this, you don't get the money. So if they don't follow all these regulations, they don't get the funding. Now, issues with that is that the charter only lasts 3 to 5 years, and then it gets turned back to an irregular school. So what happens then? You choose for your child to go to this charter school because you don't want them doing all these state and federal mandates. And then it gets turned back into a regular school, and now they have to do the mandates, but your child is still going to that school. So what then? Do you move them? Do you uproot your child at that point? What do you do? Also, a question to be asked is, isn't there a need for some regulations? Why is the state and federal government having a regulation that isn't needed? And if it's such a bad regulation, shouldn't it be lifted off of all schools and not just charter schools? For example, some charter schools, since they don't follow the same regulations as state and federal schools, and therefore don't get all the funding, they can hire teachers without certain educational degrees. Do you want your child taught by a teacher that doesn't have an educational degree? Now, that's not true in most cases, but that is an extreme scenario. Now, what's good about charter schools is it does allow the teachers to focus on those needs of the students, because they're free from a lot of the state and federal regulations. Now, I do want to make clear they're not free from all of them. It's just certain ones, depending on what they apply for. A lot of times the teachers like it because the teachers get to be creative in their teaching, which is something that doesn't happen so much when there's a lot of state and federal regulation. The funding issue is tough because, again, they're not getting as much from the state, so you see a lot of parental involvement, a lot of fundraisers, a lot of trying to make the ends meet. Interestingly, your book says that academics have not proven to be significantly better, though, in a charter school, which is interesting. And that charter schools have failed, but it's based upon mismanagement of funding because, again, they don't really get as much funding, so they have to be very careful with what they have. So, charter schools are another way of choice. The next is open enrollment, which is kind of less invasive than the other two. And basically what it is it allows students to enroll in any school within the district. So the parents can pick whatever school. If there's, 5 schools in the district, it'll let them enroll in any of them in the district. And they kind of call this a controlled choice. Oops. Now, one thing about that is you can't there's not money crossing district lines, which is what we talked about before. That doesn't happen here because it's all within the same district, so the money's going back into the district. It's just going based upon different schools. But there is still a shift in the population because, again, you still may have all this group of students wanting and this group of parents wanting their students to go to this school and all wanting to go to this school. So you're still having a lack of diversity. Also, that still affects the comparison of scores within in the district. If you have all the high SES in one group, all in one school, all the middle SES in one school, and all the low SES in one school, and you try to compare that data, it's going to be drastically different. And you're going to wonder why they're all living in the same district. Why do they have different test scores? Well, because they're segregated. One bit of fairness, I feel, is that a lot of times they will let those who live in that zone choose first. So if there's a really great school and I live in the zone for it, I get to choose to send my child there before somebody who lives outside of the zone. So it does give priority to those who do live near the school, which I think is fair. Next, we have magnet schools, which are similar to charter schools because they are public schools. But instead of charter schools are just kind of a general school, they kind of run like a regular school. Magnet schools specialize in a specific area or theme. And so in bigger counties, you'll see this. They may have a magnet school for sciences. They may have a magnet school for the performing arts. They may have a magnet school for sports. And so along with the regular education that they provide, they really push science. They really push performing arts. All of the extracurricular activities are related to that. And so what's good about this school is it allows, if this is part of school choice, it would allow those from low SES backgrounds that would normally be zoned to go to a school that say is below performing. It allows them, if they have the talent, to go to one of these magnet schools, say for performing arts, for sciences. So it really kind of makes it a little bit of an even playing field, because in without a magnet school, those students would be asked to go to a private school if they wanted a special, area or theme. And if they have a low SES, they usually can't afford it. So it does give low SES students a chance. Transportation, though, is still an issue. If that school's across town and you live in a low SES and your mom works three jobs, how are you going to get there? Also, magnet schools are kind of like private schools in that they can pick who they accept because it's based upon the level of, based upon who has the most performing art experience, who has the most science experience. So a lot of times, the student must have a background of excellent academics, which then again kind of segregates. So you end up with your best students going to a magnet school and everybody else going to a regular school. So it does kind of segregate the different groups again. The next discussion is regarding No Child Left Behind, which came into effect in 2001 and technically is not in effect anymore, but a lot of the pieces are still used and ingrained in school and school reform. So, one thing is that it was definitely based upon accountability of teachers teaching what they're supposed to be teaching and students performing the way they should. And part of it required schools to not only report growth for the entire school based upon reporting the test scores as an average of the overall school, but they had to also submit each subgroup. So, all the disability students, they had to submit their scores, all the minorities. So, they judged not only as a whole, they didn't compare just the whole. School in general to other schools, but they also compared this disability group to this disability group, this minority group to this minority group. And so each school had to show annual yearly progress of all areas, not just the school in general, but you had to show where the disabled students improved, the minority students improved, which you can see where that does help with accountability and it does ensure that we're not leaving or forgetting about disabled students or minority students. You're not just pushing them to the wayside and hoping everybody will average everybody else out. You really have to show where you're working with all subgroups. Schools that did not consistently make that annual yearly progress would be subjected to alterations made by the federal government or again school choice for parents. So that's how the idea of school choice kind of came about. Next, No Child Left Behind sought to define a highly qualified teacher and what that is. And so, again, let's review kind of what that is. A No Child Left Behind highly qualified teacher um, stated that that teacher must have a bachelor's degree in an education program from an education program field, and they must have a certification in the subject that they teach. So the Georgia certification, they've passed the certification exam in whatever subject they teach. So, for example, I teach sixth grade science is what I teach. I have a degree in middle grades education, which takes care of my bachelor's degree, and I've passed certification for sixth grade science. So I am teaching sixth grade science, I have a degree in it, and I've passed the certification for it. I am highly qualified. But what if my situation is I have a degree in English education and I'm a certified English, I have a certification for high school English, but I'm asked to teach history because there's a shortage. Technically, you can do that if your principal approves that, but you aren't highly qualified because, again, here you don't have the certification in exactly what you're teaching. The next kind of conversation is regarding business partnerships and academies, which is something that's happened more so within the past decade or so. And that is beginning to focus more on job readiness for high school students and helping them transition into the workforce. It's not just past high school, then we move you to college. Past college, we move you to the workforce, and you're kind of left in on your own in the in between times. It's more fluid transition into college, fluid transition into the workforce from education. So, one way we're doing that is through business partnerships. So, we're partnering with businesses that will allow high school students to intern or have kind of like a part time job to where they're given guidance. They learn about the communication, the work ethic, and the understandings related to that job so that when they are hired onto that job after they graduate, it's not a brand new phenomenon for them. They've kind of been trained. Also, is the idea of academies. They're called different things, career academies, those type things. And those are actually sometimes housed as a department within a high school. And that changes the structure of the high school program. So instead of just taking ninth grade English, ninth grade math, ninth grade history, 10th grade English, 10th grade math, 10th grade history, 11th grade math, instead of doing that, there's either electives or tracks that allow the student to take classes based upon the career they're interested in. So, yes, everybody gets general English, everybody gets general math, but perhaps if you're interested in the medical field, you take some nursing prep classes. If you're interested in education, you take some education prep classes, and it kind of exposes you to what the profession is like, which will allow you to change your mind before you go to college and take classes in those fields, as well as it will allow you sometimes to earn credits. So sometimes it'll transfer to college credit, or sometimes it can be a tech degree. So some, like for example, you can earn some nursing tech license while in high school, um, completing programs. You can definitely, with vocational mechanics, welding, things like that, you can actually earn that while you are in high school based upon these academies and credits that they provide. Lastly, with school reform, we have the idea of a full service school, which is somewhat unfamiliar, maybe to some of you, but it is potentially where schools could eventually find themselves. And so these full service schools provide not only the academic education, not only teaching to the students, but it also provides physical and mental care for the entire family. It's kind of like a one stop shop. So, for example, it would provide medical and dental care. So, once a week, a doctor would come, and the students or the family members could come and see that person. Um, while at the school, if your child attends that school, you can come and use that facility. Dental care, students who can't afford or don't have transportation to go to a dentist office, the dentist comes there, they get pulled out of class and have their dental work done. It could provide adult training, so how to be a parent, basic, again, like we were talking about before, academies, those type things for the adult parents. After school care, which is kind of common among schools, social work. So if there are social work cases or legal services that are needed for the family, they're housed there at the school. Family counseling, emergency treatment, all of that would be housed under the school itself. Now, the question that I have initially is, number one, are we sacrificing our academic education? So if the students are being pulled out for their dental work, for their counseling, for their legal service, for their emergency treatment, when are they learning? Another thing that I am a little bit concerned about is who pays for this. Are the parents still having to pay for each of these like they would if they went to that actual business? Is the school paying for it? Or is the state paying for it and that it's just being housed at the school? Is something to be asked and questioned, as well as is this the role of a school? Now, on the other end, you can see where this would be important, if especially for low SES who can't get to, they don't have transportation to get to the dentist, they don't have transportation to get to the social work, they don't have transportation to get to counseling. If they can get to the school, they can get to everything that they need to get to. So, that's something to be questioned. Again, a little bit of a new idea, but something that could possibly happen. So that rounds out our conversation related to school reform and some of the possible proposals for school change in the future.